Good evening. I will now call to order the Chesterfield Township Planning Commission meeting on February 7th, 2023. I will call the roll. Paul Miller is here. Rick LaBelle. Here. Brian Demink. Here. Carl Leonard. Here. Mark Renault. Here. Ralph Jaworski. Here. Jim Klanowski. Here. Richard Brokart.
Here.
Brian Carr is excused. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Can everyone please silence their cell phones? Approval of minutes of prior meetings. I will make a motion to approve the minutes of January 17th, 2023. Support. We have a motion by Mr. Miller, support by Mr. Renault. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion passes. There is no public hearings tonight, so our reviews, our Secretary Rick will do the ones we can do in a timely manner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Item A is Gratiot Mini Storage Site Plan 2023-01. It's in the M1 District, 5.39 acres, northwest side of Gratiot Avenue, north of 24 Mile Road and south of Hickey Road. The parcel ID is 15-09-08-426-001 and 15-09-08-426-015. There was, let's give Giffords Webster, Stephanie, if you can give them a moment and give them a review.
Yes, thank you. So in my review letter dated January 31st for plans submitted on the 25th of January, there were quite a few changes the applicant made from the previous set of plans that were reviewed. Those are on the first page of the review letter. That includes just some administrative updating for the parcel identification numbers, and then they were able to meet the required front setback of 140 feet, provided a 10-foot wide concrete sidewalk along Gratiot, and provided details on the frontage screening. They also provided lighting details, showing that all lighting is shielded and pointing downward, and provided parking calculations and updated their landscaping materials to note that they were not including any plants that had thorns. I would like to point out that the proposal does not include any sort of office space. It will not have any staff, and so because there's no employees, no office space, no parking was provided. And with that, no bicycle facilities were provided either. The only administrative item to be reviewed would be just confirmation of the frontage landscaping, that the width is 10 feet. But otherwise, the usual items are available for Planning Commission consideration, including building materials. I will also note here that the applicant does have screening from Gratiot, but the building frontage on Gratiot does not include brick. So that should be something the Planning Commission may wish to discuss. And then the last thing I'll note is that in my review letter, I mentioned that the bollard height and the color were not provided. They were actually provided. That's available on sheet 6, and those are in compliance with the ordinance standards. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Osborne. I had the opportunity to speak with the applicant prior to the meeting, and there's a bit of a conflict on the drawing. If you look at one drawing, it shows, it's just a generic drawing that the manufacturer, the metal building manufacturer put together. It shows doors along Gratiot, which doesn't allow for the opportunity to put in brick. But if you look at something that the architect put together, they don't actually show the doors. So I had the opportunity to speak with the applicant, and I asked him to speak on this on behalf of this. Maybe he can identify the buildings. Maybe Jonathan can bring it up. What we came to See, if you look at that drawing, on the end of the building, they've got a number of doors. That would be on Gratiot. It shows it at the end building. So the applicant he's planning on putting, so it will be the second row down. He's planning on having 4 units in the 2 buildings along Gratiot. What the applicant has agreed to is that he would move the 2 outside doors to the side of the building. Then he would just have doors, just 2 doors in the front, and the rest of the building would be brick. He also, the other buildings, the shorter building, I believe was Building G, is the building that is down on the right-hand side, second from the bottom. That'll all be brick, other than the 2 man doors, because that leads into a corridor inside the building. So there will be brick on the front of the building along Gratiot. And the owner is here this evening. If you want to speak on behalf of if you would come up to the podium and verify what I just stated.
How you doing? My name is Brian Calabat, and I am proposing putting up a self-storage facility, as Rick has explained. And yes, originally the plans were for me to put 8 doors on the outside, consisting of 5-foot doors with a little border on each door. And after discussing this with Rick, we can shrink that to put just 2 doors right in the middle, and the rest would just be bricked, and I'm more than willing to accept that.
You want to speak for a moment on the landscaping that Stephanie had brought up as well?
Can my engineers speak on that? They are with me also.
Good evening. My name is Brad Brickle from Noack and Frelss Engineers, 46777 Woodward Avenue, Pontiac, Michigan. With respect to the landscaping, per the requirement, we did add the 5-foot frontage berms across the frontage. And you'll note as you kind of head northeast, there's an existing, kind of on the east side of the drain over there, there is an existing heavily vegetated 5 to 6 foot berm along there already. So what we'll do is, we'll go through there, clean up any vegetation that's nasty, vines, things like that, and make it a little more attractive across that frontage. With respect to the perimeter, as you can see, we've got a significant buffer on that north side adjacent to the detention pond. And what we did is we added, that's all master plan for light industrial, but what we did is we added arborvitaes along that whole north end, and then we added a lot of trees along the south side of that pond. And as you kind of progress to the west along that north side, so what we did is, per the ordinance, we put in a 6-foot high berm, and essentially it wraps around the whole site. The residents that are to the kind of the west, they wouldn't, they would be covered by that 6-foot berm. And also what we did is, if you look at the elevations, not that you have to look here, but the 6-foot high berm is from the west property line. And so then once you get onto the site where the buildings are, it drops down an additional couple feet. So we're really gonna have about a 9-foot high berm on the lower side, on the east side. And those buildings max height are 9 foot 4 inches. So essentially the top of that berm is gonna be level with the top of the buildings. So you won't see anything from there. And I think that's about it. In respect to the berm in the front, that's a 46-foot wide berm across the frontage from the back of curb to the property line. Then with that sidewalk being inside a little further, you're well over 50 feet between the back of walk and the pavement on site. And that's all I had on landscaping.
Thank you. Bring it back to the commission. Mr. DeMink?
I'm good.
Mr. Brokart?
Did you guys address a fire suppression system in the building?
So what we did is they didn't provide a fire suppression system, so there's 2 options. You either could put a fire suppression system and not have as many hydrants around, But because of this type facility, we were under the threshold of the requirement for that with the building size, square footage. So, but we still met with the hydrant coverage. So what we did is we ran a hydrant all the way to the west, to the rear property, and we conversed with the fire department on this. And then we put one kind of north up there by the detention pond. So we meet the fire coverage requirements.
Thank you, that's all.
Mr. Renault?
I am all good, thank you.
Mr. Jaworski?
Nothing for me tonight, thanks.
Mr. Kulowski?
I'm good.
Mr. Leonard?
I'm all set, thank you.
Mr. LaBelle?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion to approve Gratiot Mini Storage Site Plan 2023-01 with a few things that'll be part of my motion. First of all, on the drawing, they show the dumpster material as a poured wall with a brick imprint. The applicant has agreed to provide brick or better on the dumpster enclosure, so his dumpster enclosure will have brick or better. The facade on the front of the buildings along Gratiot will be brick, and that'll be on buildings B, D, and G. And then I would also ask administratively that they do put the dimensions of the landscape berm on the drawing. Administratively, just submit it to Jonathan. And with that, I'd like to make a motion to approve.
Support.
We have a motion by Mr. LaBelle, supported by Mr. May. All in favor?
Aye.
Motion passes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a nice night.
Item B is Medical Office Building Site Plan 2023-02. It's in a C3 zoning, 2.31 acres south of 23 Mile Road and east of Sass Road. The parcel ID is 15-09-22-201-017. The address is 3210023 Mile Road. There are a number of things that need to be addressed, and Ms. Osborne, if you wouldn't mind, please.
Thank you. So I will note, Commissioners, that we received plans for this proposal on Friday. I did get a chance to review them, but the letters in your packet is probably not the most up-to-date. So I'll note what we were able to see had been changed in the revisions and what's outstanding. So in terms, there are quite a few things that were addressed, but for your focus tonight is what's outstanding. So we are missing calculations of the building materials that were used. It looks like the applicant is likely in compliance, but we don't have the percentages noted on the plans that are required for ensuring that. There's a sidewalk on 23 Mile Road. The plans that were submitted don't show that being fully connected in front of the parcel. The number of parking spaces needs to be updated. There's a discrepancy in the number provided on the plans and what's written in the notes, and that's a pretty easy administrative detail to rectify. The light pole placement needs to be confirmed. 2.5-foot setback is required from the curbs. And we are looking for information about the bollard height. A minimum height was given, but want to ensure that it complies with the maximum height as well as the color. Just one moment. We also want to point out that the applicant has revised their landscaping plans to include stone over geotextile fabric in lieu of grass. So the Planning Commission should note that when they're reviewing the landscaping plans to determine if that's acceptable. In terms of parking, the parking lot extends all the way to 23 Mile, and it's quite a ways for clients to get from the spots near 23 Mile all the way back to the office building. So you may wish to discuss options to create some sort of pedestrian walkway or designate an area for pedestrians to improve safety. And the bike facilities are provided. They have provided sufficient number of bike racks. They're currently located in the front of the building near the dumpster. So the Planning Commission may wish to discuss if there are other placements that may be more clearly visible and easily accessible to the approach of the building. And I believe that is all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Osborne. I did have an opportunity to meet with the engineer. He's in the audience this morning, if you wouldn't mind. If you'd like to comment on all of those things, and we'll have discussion.
Good evening, Eric Osling with Siebert Keast Lehner, Planners and Engineers. This is Mr. Jay Folsky, developer. We'll fill this out. How would you like to begin? Was there a particular question to begin?
I can read. First of all, and I believe that we can take care of this, a lot of stuff administratively. If you could give us the calculations of the building material that the building's being made out of. From what I saw in the drawings, the building brick and stone.
I apologize, the architect's font was very small, but Mr. Folsky calculated approximately 80% brick, 20% stone. If you were to refer to the architectural plan, there are small, very small fonts that has that information.
Secondly, the second item that was brought up was the spacing of the pole lights to the edge of the parking lot. Looking at the drawing that the gentleman apparently gave us recently, that dimension of 2.5 feet is on the drawing. So that is on the drawing. We also talked about matching parking spaces to the calculations of the drawing. The applicant suggested.
I'm sorry, sir, I'm not hearing you. I can hear you there, but I can't hear you in the speaker.
Oh, I'm sorry. The applicant suggested that we leave the amount of spaces that are currently on the drawing, which are sufficient, from what I understand, and he wants to add a tree, which is wonderful. So I think we'll just leave that alone at this point. Something else that him and I had talked about was the dumpster location. As you all can see, the dumpster's in the front of the building, but it is in reality behind another building. The building that's on 23 Mile Road, the dumpster is behind the building. The way that the wetlands are on the property and just the configuration of the site, what the applicant has agreed to do is to provide a brick or better enclosure, because on the drawing, it gives two options, and the applicant is willing to do the brick or better for the dumpster enclosure, and then screen it with trees on both sides so that there's the parking lot from the building that's to the east of it, I believe, would be also, it would be screened away from them as well so that they couldn't see it. So in my eyes, I think we've done what we can with what they have. The next thing I'd like you to talk about is one thing that I had forgotten to talk to you about out front there was, one of the things that I forgot to talk to you about out front was the possibility of a sidewalk or a way for people, striping some way for people. The parking lots that are in the front along 23 Mile Road, they'll be walking through the travel lane for people coming in and out of the site. Can you provide a sidewalk? Can you provide some kind of striping, something so that
We certainly
visitors that are
have
visiting
saved
the
some
site-
space along the west property line. If you believe that we could trim the neighbor's asphalt and put a sidewalk in behind the curb, we could accommodate that.
Otherwise, there'd be what, striping in the parking lot?
We're-
I believe striping in
We're looking
the
for
parking
some
lot is-
idea here, what we can do to make the people that are visiting the building safe.
Yeah, I mean, more striping, because I don't think people are gonna walk west than to come north. They're gonna walk directly toward the door. So I believe that they're gonna stay in the roadway anyways, instead of crossing, get up on the sidewalk, then come around, then come back down. So some kind of striping, I think would be more efficient.
Okay. Something for us to consider. And then lastly, there's the stone over the geocloth. Could you put that on the drawing, please?
Sorry?
Ms. Osborne brought up that she was looking for a detail on the stone over the geocloth in the landscaping.
Oh, I can add a detail.
Administratively. So, Mr. Chairman, I think the only thing we really need to discuss is how to get the pedestrians from along 23 Mile Road up to the building for the rest of the commission. Thank you.
Mr. Demink? Mr. Brokart?
I was looking at the Selfridge review, and they talked about storm water detention. You guys are building a basin. Did you take into account their recommendations? They cite section 2.3 of the FAA circular. I'm not familiar with that. I'm just curious if you guys have looked at that and what you're going to do to address that concern. Stormwater detention.
We've got the preliminary calculations on there. The detention is adequate, and we're doing bioretention for stormwater quality. But because it's such a thin parking lot, there's no need for storm sewers. We're just going sheet flow through the curb, a gravel shoulder into the bioretention. And then that feeds into the detention.
So did the Selfridge review help you at all? Did you go along with that, or are you consistent with what they're recommending?
I don't see why there'd be a problem. This fits exactly with what the county wants to do with innovative green infrastructure.
Thank you. I'm okay, thanks.
Okay. Mr. Renault?
No, we've covered all my concerns, thank you.
Mr. Jaworski?
Nothing from me.
Mr. Klinowski?
Looks fine.
Mr. Leonard?
I'm good, thank you.
Mr. LaBelle?
Jonathan, would you mind going down, scroll down so that we can see the sidewalk on 23 Mile Road, please? There's an existing sidewalk that runs along 23 Mile Road, and he's tying into that. I don't know if you can see that on the drawing. Okay. And to Mr. Burkhart's question, if I may elaborate, please, how long will the water be sitting in the detention pond? I know it's not a retention pond, so there's no geese,
It's a detention pond.
it's a detention pond.
The
How long will that
calculation
water?
will come in engineering, and I believe it's a 48 to 72-hour release.
And Mr. Burkhart, typically Selfridge is okay with that. If it's a detention pond, water doesn't sit in there, it goes away.
Entertain a motion?
The voltage are on there, they're on the ground. Ms. Osborne just brought up two more things. As you and I spoke, the bollard height,
Yes.
if you could look at our ordinance, there is a minimum, and you're not meeting the minimum yet, as well as the maximum. And the color, it doesn't identify a color on the drawing.
What was the,
Administratively, again, that can be just, added to your drawing.
what was your pleasure? Do you know the height of that bollard?
6 feet is the maximum height.
6-foot bollard? And the color?
And the color, identify the color. A
Should
natural
it be
tone is
yellow?
typically what we ask for.
Is yellow in line with what you're looking to do, or? Normally, you'd see yellow or red for safety.
The ordinance asks for a natural earth tone for the bollard. However, the Planning Commission has approved typical bollard color, which is yellow, I believe. So that would be up to the Planning Commission at this point.
I don't have a problem with yellow if everybody else does.
I'm good with yellow.
Anyone else? Anything else? Oh, the bike rack. Would you speak for a moment about the bike rack placement? There was something else that was on the...
Yes, we have plenty of room for the fire department T-turnaround, so just south of the dumpster location would be a 4-bike rack, 3 being required, 4 being provided. In actuality, it's double-sided. You could say it's an 8-bike rack, but it would be on the asphalt next to the dumpster.
Well, the question that came up was, typically the bike rack is closer to the entrance of the building. I believe that this is a multi-tenant building. Is there any way you can move it closer to the building, or is that the best place for it?
Well, on the pavement, but that's the configuration. We can put it anywhere closer to the building. Let's say if it was turned sideways from where I'm showing it, adjacent to the sidewalk, that would be the most probable location.
Oops, it's gone. That's our ordinance.
That's what Jill wants. That's too bad, Jill.
Why don't you read it? Read it to him, see what it says.
Thank you, Mr. LaBelle and Mr. Chair. We had one additional question about the sidewalk. We're wondering if it will come down along the west side of the parking lot, and then with the striping at the narrow point as well, and then continue along the east side to the building. I guess if you could just provide some detail about what you're picturing for the pedestrian walkway, that would probably be helpful to the commission.
Is that what you wanted to do, is paint it on the driveway?
Yes.
Did you want to expand it by 5 feet?
What is it now? I don't-
If he was to paint it on paint the pedestrian path on the asphalt, would he have to increase that drive by 5 feet?
I'm gonna ask Jonathan and Jill for some insights there, so whether that will need to be increased.
We were making, I was just making a observation. So just to clarify, are we suggesting that the sidewalk come through the parking lot or a paved path? And do we feel that that's a safe and efficient way to get people from the sidewalk on 23 Mile to the building?
Personally, I don't think so. And if there is an opportunity for a sidewalk on the west side, and as you said, cross over, it
And
gives them an
there'll be
opportunity to
curbs,
get away
right?
from traveling cars in that lane.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
Ask a question to the applicant. Would you be able to extend the curb on the east side of the parking lot just out to a 5-foot walk? As opposed to just
I don't particularly think it'll work on the east side with the nature of the curb cuts for the stormwater. So it would be on the west side, whether it would be tight to the boundary line behind the parking spaces.
And if it was an extension, I think it should be 7 feet, because you'd have vehicle overhang over that sidewalk as well.
And that's why I asked, because the neighboring asphalt encroaches onto this property. So I believe we have 8 feet and a fraction. I can't see the dimension from here. But that 7-foot sidewalk would require saw cutting the edge of their asphalt. I don't know if that then narrows their access to that side of the building. I certainly, I don't know the history of the site. I don't know if there was a lot split first and the optometrist paved onto Mr. Folsky's property, or if it was already paved and they split it with the asphalt encroaching on Mr. Folsky's property. But if that's where you want the sidewalk, I would think that that's the best place for it.
Anybody have any opinions on there, Mr. Jaworski?
And I don't don't know which way to go with it, be honest with you. I don't know. Item nothing.
I don't have anything specific. Having it elevated rather than just striped, with paint. I think I would prefer elevated concrete. I think it might be better just to have it look like a normal sidewalk. Just elevated concrete.
We're trying to, come to an agreement this evening rather than, postponing making a decision. So at this point, I think that what would you provide to make it safe for? Do you want us to postpone making a decision this meeting tonight and push it off till our next meeting? Or do you want to propose something this evening?
I think that's what you're asking. They're asking.
Yeah, and, what are your choices? 7-foot wide walk along the complete west side? Or what's the other option?
That's up to you. Like I said, we're trying to make your pedestrian safe. And the reason for the 7-foot wide is because the car, the front of the car would encroach on the sidewalk if it was.
And where's
up
the
against the curb.
sidewalk gonna end then?
I'm sorry?
Where's it gonna end? Is it gonna come straight south? And then they're gonna go across the asphalt then?
Yeah.
Well, I think that what they're talking about, let's talk about plan east on the right-hand side of the parking lot, have it come straight down, and then have striping across the parking lot, just as you have striping now for the handicap lane. Continue the striping all the way across from that island across to the building.
Is that gonna screw up your light pole? We could have them put it somewhere else.
You thinking east side or west side?
West side.
It would be the west side of the,
Okay.
your building would be on the west side, but plan east on the right-hand side. If you're looking at the plan, north would be up on top, east would be to the right, west would be to the left, south would be the bottom.
So you're saying on the left-hand side?
No, on the right-hand side. The west side of, I'm sorry, we'll stick with what's truly there. The west side of the part of the driveway.
Right, okay. And then stripe it across the asphalt? When it gets to the park?
I think that there would be a compromise, yes.
All right.
Okay, we'll have to relocate that light pole. Or is there two on that side? I can't see from here.
And that pole, the guidelines don't come in there?
I don't think so. I think we'll clear those. They're up front, so I'll just have to move that tree.
Side of the parking lot all the way down, and then stripe going.
That's that. Well, as far as the other discussion on that sidewalk, and I'm sorry if you did say it, I couldn't hear it, that east end of the building, because of the approximation of the wetlands, you don't need that to continue 180, 360 degrees around the building?
Well, gosh, if you're offering it, that'd be great, but I understand what you've done. Our concern is that we have all of those doors covered, so if there is an emergency, they have a snow-plowed or a shoveled sidewalk to get away from the building.
Right.
Yeah, they would exit south and then head west and then north again.
Right. So you've done what we've asked you to do.
Okay.
So with that, would entertain a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion. I'd like to make a motion to approve, and there are a number of items that have to be taken care of administratively. The first item on my list is, as part of my motion, is we talked about the dumpster location. The applicant is offered and will put trees on both sides of the dumpster location to screen it from 23 Mile Road as well as the adjoining property. The applicant also had said that there is 80% brick and 20% stone as part of their building calculations. We'll make sure that that is on the drawing as well. The next thing is the bollard, maximum bollard height. The applicant has agreed to add the 6-foot height with a yellow or a neutral toned color painting. The next thing is the applicant has offered to, or is going to put a sidewalk coming from 23 Mile Road to the building on the west side of his parking lot, and then there's going to be continuous striping across the parking lot, allowing the people to have a place to walk. The applicant has also agreed to add to his drawing that in the landscape area, he'll have stone with a geocloth underneath it. And as far as the bike rack, I'm fine with where the bike rack is at. With that, I'd like to make a motion to approve.
Support. We have a motion by Mr. LaBelle, support by Mr. Rennell. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes.
Thank you.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Jay, did you want to finish your portion?
The next item is item C, Austin Catholic Academy Facility, Site Plan 2022-04. It's a planned unit development. Application phase is 13.7 acres on north side of 23 Mile Road, east of North Avenue. The address is 25925 23 Mile Road. Ms. Osborne, the applicant has since came back with another drawing, and Ms. Osborne will go over with what we're looking for.
Thank you. So the plans that we're reviewing tonight are based, or my review letter is dated January 19th, based off of those plans. So there were several changes since the last review. The applicant is proposing to implement an 8-foot-high PVC privacy fence along the north side of the parcel. In addition to that, they're proposing a landscape buffer. We don't have any information about the size, the material, the spacing used in that landscaping buffer, but it is noted that there is one in front of that fence. The softball field has been shifted slightly to allow a 20-foot setback between the furthest edge of the right foul line and the north property line. And then additional shade trees were proposed on the southwest side of the plaza near the fire lane. But again, information about that landscaping has not been provided. Mr. LaBelle, would you like me to go through deficiencies? And Mr. Chair, would you? Okay. So those were the changes from the previous plans that we saw. So a lot of what I'll say now is maybe sounding familiar. It's something that you've probably heard previously in terms of deficiencies in their plans. So on page 3 of my review letter, it's noted that some of the dimensional requirements are not met, specifically those for athletic field setbacks. And it's noted which fields are not in compliance with either the rear or the side setback. And most fields are not in compliant in one or both dimensions. The proposed fence is also not compliant. What's required is either a 6-foot-high decorative masonry wall or a 6-foot-high decorative masonry wall or pressure-treated fencing. And the applicant is not proposing a wall or a wood fence, and so they're asking for that waiver as part of PUD approval. Additionally, the exterior lighting doesn't meet the requirements. The lighting is higher than the ordinance allows. The light poles range from a minimum of 60 feet to 80 feet. And so a waiver is being requested for that. There is some light spilling over into neighboring properties as well. And so the Planning Commission may wish to discuss with the applicant how that's going to be mitigated. The lighting proposed is flood lighting, which is not allowed. But again, something that the Planning Commission may consider for this application. Moving into page 7 of the review gets into the landscaping requirements. The internal parking lot landscaping hasn't been provided. The applicant has asked that they be able to provide this landscaping elsewhere since the parking lot is not part of the current updates. So 18 trees have been proposed in the rear of the building, but we don't know the type and size of those trees. The frontage landscaping has also not been provided. Again, the applicant has asked that this be postponed and as part of the contract for the PUD, since they're not currently doing any work to the front of the building in the frontage of the parcel. Let's see. Talked about dimensions, and I believe that is it. Thank you.
Thank you. Is somebody here from Austin that would like to discuss these items?
Good evening, Commissioner Scott Baker. Glad to be back. We're not proposing any sidewalks from 23 Mile Road, so don't worry about that. Just want to address a couple of these things. Yes, we did take the comments seriously last time about including not only a fence for the residents, a heightened fence. As noted by Ms. Osborne, we're proposing an 8-foot fence. We did bring samples of the vinyl material. I think it's a higher quality and a longer durability than the wood fence that could have been put in its place. Additionally, my client is proposing to create an approximate 30-foot landscape buffer on that north elevation of the property, separating the residential homes from the athletic fields. Per the ordinance, they intend on putting those 2-inch caliper leaf maple trees, sterilized maple trees, seedless. I'm not a tree person, but 30 foot on center. So that would put approximately 20 additional trees in addition to the 19 that are 19 trees that have been added to the southern part of the athletic complex there. So and the intent behind that number was to compensate for those trees that were requested to be placed in the parking lot. But given that this phase of the project, there's no intent to improve that parking lot, we did want to provide the township with those trees elsewhere on the site. The 50-foot setback, we took the comments from the commission, and we were able to shift the entire field down. If you'll recall, we were at 4 feet setback, so now the entire football field, soccer field, a baseball field meet that 50-foot setback from the residential properties. The only spot you'll see is the right field foul pole, which is not a permanent foul pole, it's temporary. We moved it as far south as possible. However, we left it on the map. It's approximately would result in a 20-foot setback. That is something that Austin is willing to shorten that even further, in essence, just truncating that right field, placing the foul pole at the 50-foot buffer mark, which would result in approximately 150-foot right field fence. A little bit shorter than what they had hoped for, but if that's a condition that the commission is absolute on Austin meeting, they are willing to do that. Additionally, we provided with this one, we were provided from Musco Lighting with respect to I know you call them floodlights, but they're not floodlights. They're different. It's a vastly improved LED directed light technology. There is almost absolutely no spillover. Included in the packet that was provided, and I believe we have a blow-up of it here, is what Musco has proposed. And this isn't speculation. This is a guarantee from the company that if the light pollution exceeds what they're proposing, they will come in and fix it. So there's only one portion behind the first light post C1 that's approximately 0.9 foot candles, and their standard, they measure it at 3 feet off the ground. The township's ordinance requires that it be 0.25 foot candles at eye level. So I guess depending on the stature of whoever goes out to measure, I would suspect that with the addition of those trees, that those numbers will be 0 or well within the 0.25 foot candles that the township ordinance specifies. There was one. Removal. believe that addresses all of the concerns. There was one question about impervious surface that I noted, and that we failed to provide a calculation. This field is obviously pervious. The only additional impervious surface would be the fire lane that has been required to the south of the complex, and we could administratively update to provide that square footage. Any questions from the commission?
Questions? Mr. Palin, do you have anything? Mr. Demink? Mr. Brokart? No. Mr. Renault?
Come back to me.
Mr. Jaworski?
Is there any screening on the west side of the property for foul balls?
So on the, currently on the west side, and we had talked about temporary netting on the north elevation for the residents, but right now the west side is all just woods. There's no residential, there's nothing, it's all nature.
No, nothing from me.
Mr. Leonard?
I'm all set, thank you.
Mr. LaBelle?
Questions or comments?
Comments on the lighting?
Mr. Chairman, I still have a bit of an issue with the amount of light that is going to the adjacent property. There's a couple of points where there is a point where there is 0.9 foot candles on one of the neighbor's pieces of property, which I still have issue with. If the panel would like to, I've installed a lot of this Musco lighting. I've done many projects with it, and if anybody has any questions about it, as this gentleman had mentioned, they are by far what they say they're going to put on the draw, or what they're going to put on the field is exactly what goes on that field. So when I say that there's 0.9 foot candles on that adjacent property, it's truly there. It's very precise. Actually, it's an amazing product. So if anybody has any questions on the installation or any projects that I have personally been part of, I can certainly give them addresses and they can go take a look at it. Thank you.
Anything else?
At this time, Mr. Chairman, other than, again, the buffer zones, the setbacks, there's still concern there with what's going on there, but it's been addressed.
Okay. What type of shade trees did you say they were?
Richard Hodak from Grissom Metz Andrews Associates Landscape Architects. What we're proposing is that I believe the minimum requirement is a 2-inch caliper tree. So we'd probably be looking at, it's called a marmo maple along that back property line. Provides it's a small seedless maple that would help maintain for the maintenance from the school side. And then along the frontage of the project, down at the front entrance gates, that would probably, we're looking at maybe a linden tree that has a little bit more dense, but they don't get as tall as the maple, so we'd provide that along that frontage.
And the ones along the property line, were they rubrums or
No,
plantoids?
it's called marmo.
Right.
It's a variety of a red, so it has a nice fall
So it's a
color to it.
rubrum. It's an Acer rubrum?
Yeah, marmo, yes.
Okay.
The cultivar is marmo.
Okay. I don't have anything else. Anybody else have anything or want to?
Yeah, you can come back to me now. So probably the one main concern that I have, which I brought up last time, you've addressed it somewhat, is still that right field line on that softball field, which you have running into the setback there. What's the length of that?
Currently, it's shown at 190 feet. If they move it back to the 50-foot setback line, then it's 150 feet at the right field line. And we took advice, I think it was Brian Carr
Yep.
had made the comment originally, So we ended up shifting the field parallel basically to the third baseline, shifting it down to try to pull it away. And one of the things that we had to look at was relative to the football goal posts, which are removable. So you have to, when you remove those, there is an in-ground box that has to be set in place. And as we looked at that and we were playing with the location, we felt from a safety standpoint, we wanted to put that box behind the second base area and out of the line of a runner coming around that area. 'Cause they're not always the most perfect level, but at least it would be in a much safer zone. The further we push that field closer, then we start getting into that conflict. So that's why we ended up with that location. And again, we have no ability to move the site or the field any closer to the school because of the fire truck access turning radius.
Okay, and then I think we had brought up last time, there was a potential discussion about maybe putting up, foul, like the nets, to catch anything, to prevent it from going into there. Did I miss that part, or?
We had committed to doing that last time. I don't
Yeah.
know that it actually ended up on the drawing. But
Okay.
again,
Yeah, I
we're
didn't
still
see it, so.
committed, and again, it would be a removable, something that
It's a
they would
temporary,
put up so that the residents won't have to look at that. I mean, because we're talking, a dozen games a year
Yeah.
probably, so. at
Okay.
most.
All right, that addresses my concern. Thank you.
I can't in good conscience recommend an approval this evening without addressing that light mitigation on the neighbor's property. What can you do? Can you shift the fields more? Can you, I mean, it's not that much, by looking at the drawing, you go in another 20, 30 feet, and, you're down to 0.1, you're down to 0.2. But there's quite a line. There's 0.3, 0.4, 0.7, 0.9, 8, 7, 7, 6, 6, 5, 5. I mean, there's quite a bit of light going across the back of many backyards.
I just want to make, because in that packet, there's two ISO candle sheets. I just want to make sure that it's
The revised photometrics is the one I'm looking at.
Okay, all right, just want to make sure, so.
Yeah, the original, or the previous photometrics, actually, the light spillage wasn't as bad as it is in the revised.
Yeah, they've laid it out from a safety standpoint of getting the most coverage, right, the most accurate and appropriate coverage on that field. We'd be more than, I'm sure that we can make that adjustment, shifting it a little bit further in. It would just have to possibly have some effect on the overall lighting. And you're well aware of is that those lights are all LED, they're very controllable, and so I think they would be able to make that modification. So if that's something that we can do administratively and resubmit, have them make the modification to that light pole to shift that pole in a bit.
And I don't know how the rest of the folks feel, but, again, you've got light poles in that buffer zone, in the 50-foot zone. You're moving the poles in. Honestly, what I'd like to see is I'd like to see the drawings updated, showing the foul pole, the foul line pole, as well as the types of trees, and something in writing guaranteeing those neighbors that they don't have light in their backyard. Is that something that you can do in a couple of weeks?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's not going to be any more egregious than what the lights they complained about from the industrial complex just to the south. We can't do anything about that. If anything, we might help by planting those trees when they do mature.
I understand that.
But, I mean, again, I'm very confident with this product that there is going to be
As am I.
zero light into the
And I don't know if the salesman's name is
residential
Jeff still, but I mean, he's wonderful about what he puts out, and it is exactly, that's why I'm saying that when he says that there's 0.9-foot candles at that part, where that, on those spots, it's there. It's truly there, and that's not fair to the neighbors. In my opinion, it's not fair to the neighbors to have that light in their backyard, because our ordinance does have a requirement of 0.25.
We can get that redone and make the adjustment.
So we have a couple options. We can table you, or we can deny you then you have to start all over again till we get that resolved.
Can you make it as a condition of approval?
Mr. Chairman, this is a PUD, so this is a recommendation to the board. I think it would be wise to make sure the planning commission is thorough and has everything concrete and in place before it gets sent to the board, so they know exactly what they're looking at as far as the recommendation goes from the planning commission.
So make a motion to table.
How much time do you need to make the adjustments? And I guess it comes back to, you know, they're gonna go through all the trouble of, they're gonna go through the, they're gonna make adjustments on the drawings. Are we okay with that 50-foot buffer zone? And, you know, it appears that they'll have all of the field activities out of there, but you still have 2 light poles in that 50-foot zone. That'll be, you know, shining onto the site. It's a utility item. I personally don't have a problem with that. And then the buffer zones at any other ends of the fields, is everybody's okay with that? Before we have them go through all of this, I want to make sure there's no other issues that, you know, that he's gonna come back and say, okay, you need to do this and you need to do that. The lighting on the adjacent property I brought up before, so it's not, this isn't a new item. So is everybody else okay with that then, or? Okay. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion to postpone making a decision for up to 2 meetings.
We have a motion by Mr. LaBelle, supported by Mr. Miller. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes.
Just a quick,
Postponed for 2 meetings,
oh, okay.
up to 2 meetings.
Up to 2 meetings, so.
Thank you.
Non-agenda related communications, number 8. Number 9, receive and file. Comments regarding agenda items. Number 10, committee reports, ordinance amendments, board liaison reports, reviews and discussions from members of the commission, consultants, and the township employees. So right now, we're going to do comments from commissioners. Mr. Demink? Non-agenda items?
Correct.
Okay.
In your discussion on the medical office, there was a discussion with reference to comments as to the Selfridge review.
It's agenda item.
In the last year or so, the drain office has instituted new procedures and new requirements as to detention. So they want detention. And it shows sometimes the inconsistency between government units. Selfridge is generally opposed to detention ponds because they are home to birds, and they're afraid of the birds and the flight. But the irony of Selfridge is, at their north boundary line along Hall Road, M59, there's a significant county drainage ditch that's wide open. And then their southeasterly property line is Lake St. Clair, which is the home to hundreds of swans, geese, and ducks. So when they say to the property owner in Chesterfield or Harrison Township, we don't want you to have a detention basin or a retention basin, and then the county drain office says we do, and that we want you to hold your water for X period of time and have it come out of the pond in a 4-inch pipe so that the sediments go to the bottom. It's an inconsistency that the property owner, developer, and engineer has to face. So Selfridge isn't moving. The drain on Hall Road's not moving. They just made improvements during this last construction season, and hopefully Lake St. Clair isn't moving. So I think you have to take what Selfridge says kind of like with a big grain of salt when they have so much water on their boundary. Thank you.
Thank you. Comments from commissioners. Mr. Demink, you have anything? Mr. Borkhardt? No. Mr. Renault? I am set. Mr. Jaworski? No. Mr. Klonowski? No. Mr. Leonard? I'm good. Mr. LaBelle?
I'm looking for volunteers for pre-planning at our next meeting.
Mr. Leonard? and Mr. Renault.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, now we'll go on to our next item, item A, the cannabis ordinance draft discussion. Ms. Bain, you want to start us off?
Sure, I'd be glad to get you started. So in your packet, we have an updated memo and an updated draft ordinance. And again, to refresh your memory on where this is just a beginning point, a template, if you will, that proposes some standards based on some of the conversation that we've had so far. So we did have a conversation at the January 17th meeting. There seemed to be general consensus that all of the cannabis facilities should be located in the M1 light industrial zoning district only. And so that is consistent with the rest of what the ordinance that you have before you includes. So we did add some new text. We changed some things around. Those were indicated in red in the draft that follows. And there were some notes that I included in blue text just to help you understand why we made the changes that we did. So this evening, I think it would be really helpful to perhaps again confirm that the M1 district is appropriate, and then think about the separation distances. We had a little bit of a discussion about that last time, and we'll walk through all this. Be thinking, and hopefully you have been thinking about some of the concerns that you have in terms of impacts of these uses on adjacent uses, and whether we feel that the standards that are included will address those. We think that generally that they do, but we want to hear from you on that. So going to jump right into the draft, if we jump to page 5 of the memo that we have, the first section is really just the definitions, and I kind of feel like maybe we should just go section by section and talk about each one generally. And we can always move back and forth as you need. But really, section 2.2, the definitions, those are consistent with the state definitions. And I don't know that there's much that the Planning Commission needs to do necessarily on those definitions. Although if anybody isn't clear on any of them, we'd be happy to talk about those. I think the only one that is helpful, that's not a state guideline, is the separation distance measurements. So what we've proposed is measuring, it's very simple, straight line from the nearest property line of the parcel to the nearest part of a building used as a marijuana facility. So those are pretty straightforward. You will, if you've looked at any other ordinances, we've seen ones where we're talking about the front entrance and as the front entrance and around the corner and turning in different ways. This is just a pretty straightforward type of standard. There's an extra little sentence there at the end that I would say that we would remove if we continue our conversation about the separation between uses and then think about whether we really need to separate between marijuana facilities themselves. But we'll talk about that in a second. Part 2 of the proposed draft is just the part where we say, part 2 and part 3, where we allow them. So we would have them as permitted uses in the light industrial district. And then part 3, because all the uses that are permitted in M1 are permitted in M2, that we would have an exclusion for that at this time, and that's up for discussion. As we get into part 4, we have just the use standards that are associated with these. So 1, 2, 3, and 4 of those sections are the approval procedures and applicability and the purpose. Those are also pretty straightforward. They're establishing language, their intent. They're telling us why we have ordinances and how we're going to apply them. And so once we get into section 5, I think now is where we really start getting into kind of the meat of the ordinance itself. With just some basic zoning application requirements. So certainly if someone's coming in for site plan approval or review, they'll have to go through section 6.1 and all of the standards there. But then there's a few extra standards that we think are helpful to be included. Really, once we get to floor plans, letter C, D, a plan for waste disposal, E, acknowledging that the property owner knows that this is going to be a marijuana facility. F, the paperwork, giving the license approval. And then once we get into G, now we start talking about the separation requirements. So here, this is based on our last conversation. We kind of kept it general for now, 1,000 feet away from a public or private pre-kindergarten, kindergarten, elementary, or secondary school building. A public park or library. It was noted that the library is in an M1 district, so it's a good idea to call it out and have the distance away from that. Commercial child care organization, so this is not an in-home daycare, but which would already be covered because it's in a residentially zoned district, which we'll get to in a second. A religious institution, building, and a building which substance abuse prevention services and treatment are provided. So those things we have right now as 1,000 feet away from those things. That's up for Planning Commission's discussion and ultimately your recommendation to the Township Board. In addition to those, 1,000 feet away from residentially zoned property. And I should note here that although the maps that you had in your packet didn't include residentially zoned properties in adjacent communities, we should do that. So that does impact a couple of the areas and those maps. We have just clarified in little c up at the top of page 8 that if there are co-locations that are compliant with the regulatory agency, that would be permissible, and then removing the space distances between facilities. So in the idea of, well, we are trying to be mindful of where the cannabis facilities could be permitted, wanting to also ensure that we have enough availability, that it's a practical set of standards as well. And then just going down, we did remove the security plan standards. That all is part of the state license requirement anyway, so it's a little bit redundant. Plus, we don't want to end up in a situation where we're requiring something different from what the state is requiring, so it's best just to refer back to that. Section 6 then is just general requirements for all establishments. This gets into prohibiting consumption, prohibiting residential uses in the same building, prohibiting outdoor storage, making sure that we're not creating hazardous situations with growth of molds and things like that. Also minimizing noise, dust, vibration, glare. Those are already standards that we have in our industrial districts, but we're reiterating those here. Looking at interior security measures, should not be visible from the public right-of-way during operating business hours, so that's primarily going to be for the retailers. But we do have a section in here on air contaminants. We know that the smell and the odor is something that the planning commissioners have raised as a concern, so those are still in here. Letter K, we did remove that. The overall design, appearance, and operation of each marijuana facility shall be compatible with the district in which it's located. If it's only one district, we already have standards for that are in the M1 district that regulate exterior facing materials to be brick and stone. There's a little bit of a typo glitch that you'll see. M says specific requirements for marijuana retailers. That should actually be 7. And then letter 7, or number 7, says the sale or dispensing of alcohol or tobacco products at a marijuana retail facility is prohibited. That should be A. So I'm sorry for the little glitch. I just happened to notice that earlier. So then what follows under M, which should be 7, are the standards that would apply for retail retailers, facilities, and then 8 is for the grower processing facilities. Again, just clarifying our word language there. And then we get into part 5, the parking standards. I think those are pretty straightforward. We discussed those briefly last time, so we can go back and have additional conversation about that as needed. We did get some correspondence about that particular issue. So that's an overview, walking you through the ordinance again, kind of highlighting some areas that I think you may want to focus, and maybe want to go back and either look at, again, the districts in which we're proposing M1, if there's still consensus on that, or if there's additional discussion about other areas that you may wish to consider, we should talk about that as well. So that's probably a good place to start, back up at the top of page 6.
Commission speak first, or the general public? Okay, anybody that wants to speak on the marijuana issue, they have 3 minutes.
Good evening, Bob Kirk, 19500 Hall Road, Clinton Township. I sent a memo earlier today with some of our thoughts. We've been in the municipal practice for about 25 years in cannabis, and the last few on both sides of the table. Some of the items we've set forth were with regard to the zoning, and that's the first one I'd like to address. You're talking about putting into the M1 zone, but if you look at your zoning map and what the sites that would be permitted, there aren't many. And you have an issue with regard to a lot of M2 south of Hickey, which are smaller sites, which are actually master planned, the way I read the master plan, to be a light industrial district. So I don't know if you'd be opening the door to more rezoning requests on that. M2 zoning, I believe it belongs north of Hickey. It's not just a zone where you're going to attract those type of users, but you need big sites. You need sites that can allow for larger truck traffic to get in and out of, let's say, on Gratiot. And also, the other fact is M2 has a lot of external factors. There could be sound, noise, dust, dirt. So you want to keep those to the north, and that's what your master plan envisions. So our thought is you should consider the M2 zones south of Hickey to be included in the zone. The other thing is that maybe consider them to be on major thoroughfares. If you have issues with regard to traffic congestion or safety, they're easier to be seen than rather in the back of an industrial park. I know you might be concerned about heavy industrial and using up some of the heavy industrial sites. That is the reason why I said a lot of the ones south of Hickey are smaller. Also, if there are large buildings you're concerned about turning into a small dispensary, you might want to limit the size of a dispensary maybe to 5,000 feet. That way you don't have this big, large building being only a portion of it being used and eating up your M2 zone properties. The parking requirements, it's 1 per 150 as a kind of a general retail, but we've seen in other communities that parking can be a problem at certain hours a day, traffic coming in maybe on a Friday, so you might want to consider something a little stronger, maybe 1 per 100, or 1 per 100 and banking some of that, allowing green space to be put in the event that it is eventually needed. The separation requirements, I didn't really study that closely, but I know I think there should be a difference between the distance between single-family residential and multiple, because along Gratiot there are multiple zones which are used as transition zones from commercial to a single family. So I think there should be some difference between the single-family buffer and the multiple family buffer. And I think that's all I have. If you have any questions. Thank you.
Yes, my name's Tom LaForest. My question is related to the M1 area. There are places within the city. I have a facility that was closed due to COVID for the last 3 years, but it's not zoned M1, but it would be a very good location. So I was wondering if the commission was going to put something in place as not only just M1, but on a case-by-case basis. Can they request a variance depending on the location of a particular facility on like an individual basis? Our facility's been vacant for 3 years due to that, and I think it would be a perfect location for something like this. It meets a lot of the parking requirements on like on a main road like Gratiot, but I'd like to know if at least to consider having an exception on a case-by-case basis, so you could go to the planning committee and request a variance based on that particular property where you would have more control in the vetting process. And I would actually give other places that are highly visible an opportunity to participate in this. So that was just my comment on just strictly the M1. I'd like to at least see something that would allow us to approach the committee and get variance requests on individual properties as you review them and they're presented. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Paul Weisberger. I'm going to echo some of the thoughts that were recently said, but I want to talk about really the kind of the white elephant in the room, and that is the concept that M2 would not be permissible, but it's allowed in M1, and to have a red line that actually carves out the only exception, M2, to prevent cannabis, doesn't seem to follow the tiered logic of intensity of uses in each district, C1, C2, C3, M1, M2. So let's talk about the white elephant. That is the issue that the community is concerned about too many? Are they concerned about traffic and parking? Are they concerned about mothballing larger buildings to only have the front part of it used for cannabis? The solution to that is to require that the facility has a maximum size of 5,000 square feet for retail, not grow, retail. That would, and then piggyback that with a parking requirement that might be 1 per 100, 1 per 125. Required to be on a major thoroughfare. And you'll start to see, if you do that, you're going to accomplish the goal of not having an uncontrolled number of facilities in your community, but also addressing planning issues and also addressing tax-based issues and job-based issues, meaning you're only going to be able, you have to be a standalone building, you can only be so big. That's going to narrow the scope of the properties. You have to have a certain amount of parking. There's not a lot of light industrial that is out there, M1, M2, that generally doesn't have a little bit of customer traffic and then a side road along the building and then some truck traffic in the back. They're not generally set up for a lot of parking, so you're really going to narrow the scope there. So I think if we could get back to like zoning issues to address the concern of too many in the community, if you allow it in M1, it should be allowed in M2. Otherwise, you're going to see a flood of rezoning that follow the master plan or follow the concepts of downgrading from M2 to M1, and you're going to see a flood of them. But I think you can accomplish what you're going after with some of the things that I mentioned. The other thing that I like to see at the buffers from residential are 500. I'd like to see it stay there. If any buffer needs to increase, I don't think it does, it would be 1,000 feet maybe from grows. The odor that's produced potentially from a retail center differs vastly from what a grow. But both of them can be remedied with proper, active carbon filtration systems. We run cigar stores. You can control any smell if it's done properly. But I'd like to see a max of 500-foot buffer from residential for retail zones. And the last thing is, there's a concern that there's pop-up churches that meet for 2 hours a week. If we could see some sort of criteria that actually has to be a legitimate church, that also parks aren't just any public land, but it's also something that's like nature preserves. It's actually a park with facilities, playground equipment, et cetera. Thank you.
Thank you.
Stavros Toma, 47677 Malonis Drive, Shelby Township. Like like Mr. Weisberger and Mr. Kirk said, I echo everything they said, and I'd also like to add in the separation distance between facilities. What that's going to cause is a race to the counter to turn your application in, and that could bring potential lawsuits and potential issues. And then if someone is second to the counter, and you might be missing out on a good user, just because of the 1,000-foot distance buffer. The cannabis community does not mind being next to each other. They're okay with it. It works, and it works in several other communities as well, like Oxford or Centerline. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mark Abraham. My address is 5291 Parker Road, Fort Gratiot. Like many of the gentlemen, attorneys and operators have spoken, I agree with almost all the points. The only thing that I do have a concern with, of course, is this differentiating between M1 and M2. As Mr. Weisberger said, Mr. Kirk, it isn't, I don't think it's the right idea to eliminate, M2 from it. M2 has certain advantages. A lot of times the footprint that an M2 facility has, because it's typically bigger, creates more of its own buffer. which, is better for the neighbors that are, that would be surrounding, whatever that facility would be. So I adamantly would, want you to consider M1 and M2. I think everybody's a lot of consensus in that. The only other thing that I do slightly disagree with is the idea that, provisioning, I can understand, putting a cap on the square footage of a provisioning facility. However, if the user's intent is to have a co-location of provisioning and processing, and that building is bigger than whatever that number, that arbitrary number is, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 square feet, I think that would have to be something that would be reconsidered. So if a building was 8,000 or 9,000 or 10,000 square feet and the use was going to be for provisioning in the front, say that would be 4,000, 5,000 square feet, whatever number you pick. But I would hate to think that the building would disqualify because it's bigger when the individual's goal is to use the rest of the building for another use, like processing. Another use that doesn't have odor problems or anything like that would be very similar to provisioning. So I wouldn't want to see a cap. I'd really want a lot of thought put into what that size is going to be. If a building's going to have a limit, it should be decided based on, is it a single use or is it going to be co-location? My plan is to co-locate, and I do.
Time's up.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you.
Good evening, John Johnson, Shady Glen here in Chesterfield Township. I wear a couple different hats. I also am the CEO for the Gratiot Avenue Chamber of Commerce and the chairman of the board of the North Gratiot Cruise Foundation, who operates a cruise every year, and a resident here in the township. So I have some grave concerns about how this all shakes out. But I'll remind you from a previous discussion that I was the organizer of the Friends of Chesterfield Township. We ran the petition drive and we ran the educational drive to have this put on the ballot and then have the voters vote in favor of this. And you may recall that we called for unlimited. And I spoke to this previously. There won't ever really be unlimited, because what will happen at some point in time here is all these business owners are going to take a look around, see who the competition looks like, how many other competitors there are, and then there will be free market forces that will come to play that will limit this ultimately over the long haul. But I'll remind you that what our petition drive called for and the voters voted on was unlimited. And my view is, and I spoke about this the last time I was here, I talked about M1, M2 and commercial, and I've had some time to think about that as a resident of the township. I'm not really in favor of the commercial necessarily. I think we have great opportunities with our commercial here. I'd like to see us stay out of it, but I do not believe that M1 alone will suffice in terms of fulfilling the mandate of the voters that there be unlimited. And so as you go about this process, and some other people spoke to this earlier today, the M1 is potentially really going to limit this in a great way, that it will not then fulfill the mandate of the people that there be unlimited. So I'm advocating for M1 and M2, and then the appropriate setbacks. I think that's up for discussion. But I hope you keep that in mind as to what the people of this township voted on, and that you not zone this in a way that makes it such that it's totally limited and there not be the opportunity for businesses to get involved. Thank you for your good work and all the hard work that you do on everything every day around here. So thanks for that. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I was going to have some of the similar comments as Mr. Johnson, but when you limited it to just M1, and then in the planner's comments, they say a retailer of cannabis is similar to a bar. The bars aren't generally in industrial districts. They're in commercial districts, C1, 2, and 3. You have Gratiot as a main commercial corridor that's totally mixed. You have retail, you have bars, you have industrial facilities, from Toys to Stanley to smaller business that are industrial. Part of this last draft, it appears to preclude consumption facilities, but on the ballot, it said unlimited to all the categories. So if you preclude that, I suspect you're just inviting litigation. And if you have this 1,000-foot setback from residential, and in the planner's comments, if you drive the industrial corridors, the industrial parks in Chesterfield, almost all of them, one side or another, abuts residential. If you go over here to the police department, industrial park, the east side is residential. If you go to 22, Mr. Carrick developed that, the west side of that is all residential, Ranch Drive. The buffer was the planting of arborvitaes. If you go to the technology park on 23 Mile Road, to the east, it's all residential. And you probably couldn't go in that park anyways, because that's a product of a consent judgment. So there's so many limitations in this draft. It appears to me that you're just inviting litigation because there's going to be so small number of parcels that are going to meet the M1 district that are 1,000 feet from residential. And then what that does is benefit a few minute property owners or operators in comparison to what you already have for industrial districts. And if you're a grow operator, you want to be in industrial because you want to have the power. You don't want to be around houses. So if you go to Harrison Township, it's all along the freeway in Selfridge. They don't have any retail centers there. You go to Mount Clemens, there's Jars. It's right on Groesbeck, just a little bit north of Cass. So I think you have to take a bigger perspective and not just limit it. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Good evening, Chris Aiello, 49432 Compass Point, Chesterfield. I've heard a lot of good comments, and then I want to thank all of you as my neighbors for taking time out of your lives to sit on this committee and see through all of these issues. But here are a few comments as a resident and an individual who's inside of the business, and I live in Chesterfield. I never thought I'd hear from my competitors that now all of a sudden a 5,000 square foot building is too big or too small, when I've done business with each and every one of them, and nobody really cares what size building you get in as long as it's in the proverbial green area. So let's not put everybody here on that mental mind chase of if 5,000 square feet is too big or too small. It just doesn't matter. Our stores range from 10 of them from 3,000, 5,000, 2,000, 1,000. It just doesn't matter. You do just work within what you've been given. The parking requirement now is we're requesting suggestions that you go to 1 to 100. Never seen that happen before commissions or council, that it gets down to this dirt that competitors now are trying to block out competition based on the number of parking spots they got because maybe they have vacant property and they can build up. I've never seen that before, and this is my 7th year in the business and going on obtaining maybe 20 licenses in the state of Michigan. It's always an argument over zoning versus overlay maps and all of that, and how many do we want in the district, how many don't we, and unfortunately we're sitting here with an unlimited number. I heard some good comments about consumption lounges. We really have not talked about that as a unit yet. Consumption lounges, if you read what your memo says, they belong in bars, and so where are the bars? They're on Gratiot. That's what it is. A consumption lounge is an organized event. A consumption lounge is not where you just go and smoke marijuana. It doesn't have a business model. Just to let you know, consumption lounges have no business models. They are the following. They let seniors, yoga classes, chess, Monday night football, bachelor parties. It's an entertainment district. Honestly, the smoking of marijuana comes after that because it can't, as a business model of itself, there's only 2 of them in Michigan open, and one is in Hazel Park, and they're not even open on Monday. They're not open on a regular basis. They're event-oriented only because that's what they are. They're entertainment spots. M1, fine. I think you did a good job of restricting that. We kind of see what unreasonable impracticality might mean, and we see some of it tonight. And M1 as it is what it is. What's the M2? It just opens it up for more. So you've identified M1, stand tall, and we're doing good there. 500 foot. A number of ways that communities have measured this. East Point has a 50-foot setback.
Time's up.
Okay. Thank you.
Anybody else? Bring it back to the board. If you open it up to M2, does that, M2 is closer to residential? It's usually in a little different area than M1? Because I know there's some M2 on Gratiot. There's a church there. There's Target there. There's.
Get the zoning map up. There are some more, the M2 does sort of go up against, especially on the west side, more of a residential area, probably because of its, it's on the other side of the railroad tracks. So the parcels on the east side of the railroad tracks don't tend to be up against residential in your zoning map.
And after our last meeting, there was an article on the news about people getting robbed delivering marijuana. I don't know if that's something that we have to worry about, or if that's
Well, I think it's good to be mindful of it and then be thinking about what kinds of standards can we be putting in place that will maintain public safety, or what could we be mindful of that we don't want to inadvertently cause an unintended consequence of creating unsafe spaces.
Thank you. Anybody else from the board want to speak? Mr. Jaworski?
No, I'm good public comments. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Mr. Klinowski?
Yeah, I guess I would tend to favor the 1 to 100 parking, because the businesses tend to have concentrated times, weekends or holidays, where they do have very heavy traffic. And as we've seen in New Baltimore, they can fill a parking lot up pretty good. I guess I would not be opposed at being in the M2, because quite frankly, we're probably going to have a lot of downzoning for facilities that want to come in. Do we have, is this for standalone buildings? Are they standalone buildings?
They could be.
Well, is it in the ordinance to be standalone building?
No.
That's something we might think about too.
It can or cannot be standalone?
We didn't specify that.
Okay.
So that could be specified. Are we, on these consumption facilities, are we allowing those, or are we not? Or are we not, are we addressing that issue?
You want to answer that one?
Are we saying no to that?
Right. We've indicated that they're all permitted.
All permitted, okay, because under general requirements for all marijuana establishments, consumption of marijuana shall be prohibited in all facilities. And that might have to be looked at if you're going to allow consumption. There's a conflict there in that one. Let's see.
What page are you on, Jim?
It's letter 6A. I think that would be unless permitted by license type.
Yeah, and on page 10, under the sale, let's see, yeah, it'd be under, let's see, facility exterior, a minimum of 25% of any street-facing facade shall have transparent glazing between 2 and 8 feet above grade. This standard is added to allow visibility into the facilities. Okay? But then, if you look under L, it says, in no instance shall marijuana or marijuana products, marijuana processing or marijuana grow operations be visible to the public from exterior of the building or from any property line. Is that, is there a little conflict between those two? I'm not sure, maybe I'm misreading the,
No, I don't think you're misreading it. I think that the,
I don't see the difference, I see a
Right.
conflict there again.
right, well, for the 25% of the transparent glazing, that is only for the marijuana retailers. So we're not gonna be looking into a processing or grow operation. And so then the next question is, well, what if I can see the marijuana or the marijuana products through that area? It's only 25%, and I think there just needs to be some careful placement, product placement, but that's really intended to be promoting visibility for public safety, the window glazing section.
But, okay, but it just seemed like there was a conflict between that. You can't,
think it's
you can't see it, but then you have to see through.
Right, I think that it's really like from maybe the public way that we want to be a little bit more specific where it's not seen from. I think the idea is we don't want to have it be a window display of marijuana products. That they're set back from the window such that they're not on display. But, you know, if you can see it just by walking past, that's not like if you're already going to the establishment, for example, then that's reasonable that you would see it. It's really more from the public way, and so we can be more clear about that.
Okay.
We said from the property line or public property. I think visible to the public is really the key to that section, that standard. Again, we're not trying to prohibit someone from walking up to the business to see what's inside, presumably they're aware. But from the property line, that's just as another additional measure to offset.
Another question, on page 8, it says, no marijuana retailer shall be located on the same zoning lot as another marijuana retailer. What is this, the zoning lot?
A zoning lot might be 2 lots that are individual parcels, but owned by the same entity and effectively operating as one larger parcel. And so that would just be a preclusion for that.
Okay, that's so if you had a large area, you could have multiple
Right,
units in it. That's what, okay. Because one of the areas that I kind of stuck out to me was 26 Meyer Road. I believe that is Bates Road. It would have been nice to have some roads on here, but where the railroad tracks are, there's quite a large area, M1 there. So, was there any issue with clustering or putting multiple units in an area?
Yeah, I think, and those were the letters right below the one that you just mentioned, F. Those would be the next ones that follow, G and H, that we recommended removing.
Oh, okay.
To prevent, I was gonna say to prevent clustering, but that's not, it's to allow them to be closer together, just not on the same zoning lot. So it's removing the barrier of an actual distance, but still saying that if you were in maybe a shopping center, that you wouldn't have multiple retailers all in the same shopping center. But that's up for discussion.
Yeah, I guess I would be okay with that if they're in the M1, and if the M1 is a large area, I think putting them in that area would be good. That'd be a good thing to have them clustered. You wouldn't have them dispersed throughout your community. They would be all together in that area. So that's kind of one of the things that I was looking at too. So, let's see. Yeah, I guess that's it for now.
Mr. Leonard? Mr. LaBelle?
Just a few questions, comments. You know, back to the M1 and M2. And, you know, and I'm sitting here and I'm thinking about the map that was created for the M1 zones. And there's been, you know, there's been questions out here this evening from the public, you know, why not M2? What about the possibility, and I don't know if we can do this or not, what about the possibility of allowing these facilities on an M2 piece of property along the major thoroughfares, along Gratiot and along 23 Mile Road, and not getting into the industrial parks where that property is there for the heavy industrial equipment, the heavy industrial areas, just as a possibility. Secondly, something that I've been thinking about is, and I know that we've heard from these experts out here that there's plenty of grow facilities, there won't be any more grow facilities. And what, in my opinion, this, just as any industry, things are evolving daily. And could there be a possibility, as it's written right now, if an individual is on an M1 piece of property and the industry evolves to where they can use a greenhouse to grow marijuana. Greenhouses aren't allowed in our M1 district. That would certainly be a consideration that we might, you know, think about. And it's fine if it's not. It's just if you've got an individual who might want to grow marijuana and he has a way of doing it to be just as efficient as these experts have already doing it with their buildings and the lighting and what have you, are we limiting our zoning so that they can't do it? I am absolutely in agreement with expanding the amount of allowable parking spaces in these facilities, if it is 1 to every 100 feet or if it's 1 to every 125. We've all seen how the tremendous amount of issues that there are with parking. That's it for now, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. DeBink?
Took the comments from the audience, whatever, the comments from the rest of the board with regards to delivery. You know, anybody can be robbed. You know, Uber drivers, DoorDash, I see it all the time. So it doesn't matter, you know, marijuana guys, I mean, I've seen it from my line of work. So, you know, with regards to that, anybody can be robbed. You know, they can follow you or whatever. And these guys are in the business. They know what they're doing on that. But, you know, Uber drivers get robbed, DoorDash guys get robbed, you know. I see it every day. So with that, I don't think we have any really means about it because it's going to be out of our hands. I mean, crime goes all over. It has no boundaries. That's it.
Thank you. Mr. Burkhart?
At our last meeting, I shared that I wasn't convinced that I knew the right answer to the zoning. But I did say whatever we decided needed to be integrated into our master plan. So I shared that I would go and read the master plan, 192 pages. If you haven't read it, it's online, pull it up. So I think we can integrate, I think we have to integrate marijuana into Chesterfield Township. What bothers me is the unlimited. If we put it in M1, it's limited. If we put it in M2 and M1, it's still limited. We could put it in every single zone, and it's still limited. But it doesn't integrate into our master plan if we do that. So right now, I think M1 is really a good way to start. I'm not 100% convinced it's the only answer, but I'm leaning towards M1 because it is very consistent with the master plan. And the clustering of industrial businesses, the clustering of these things is called out in the master plan. But the citizens want homes that families can grow up in, homes where
senior citizens can retire in. They want the parks and a lot of other things called out. Now, marijuana is not in the master plan. It wasn't because the people hadn't voted. Now they voted, so we'll work it in. And I see a lot of the same faces here every time, and I appreciate that because they're passionate, and it's an emotional issue. But the guys on the board here, everyone on the board, we'll do what's right. We'll do what we think is best. Right now, I'm leaning M1, but I'm not convinced I'm right, but I'll keep learning. So that's it for me.
Thank you. Mr. Renaud?
One, thank you for the work you've done so far. It has helped tremendously. I am in agreement with a couple of the other commissioners that we definitely have to address the parking. Every site that I have visited, cars are just stacked on top of each other, and we definitely don't. We want to make sure we can avoid that if possible. Other than that, I am still personally convinced. I think M1's a great starting point. I think we will probably see a large number of rezoning requests if we leave it there, but that's part of what we do. I'm okay with that, and other than that, I'm good to go. But thank you.
Thank you. Nobody else has any questions or comments? Jill, or have any other comments?
So it sounds like there's consensus on the M1 district. There was a little bit of support maybe for M2, but not generally widespread support.
Yeah, I mean, even if you made it all on 23 Mile, there's a lot of residential down there. I don't know if that would even be able to be put down there, so I say M1 to start, and then we'll see how it goes.
And there also seemed to be support for increasing the parking standards to maybe one per 100 or 1 per 125. And we can do a little bit of comparison and see if we can hone in on a better number for that. I think the next question would really be back to our separation requirements. So if we go back to page 7 where we outline those, we've got the 1,000 feet away from all of the sensitive land uses and 1,000 feet away from residentially zoned property. I didn't really hear anybody saying that you wanted to reduce it, but we didn't really talk about it either way for the most part. Does anybody have any other thoughts on that or support either way?
Actually, I would say I actually like your recommendations. I would accept those as you've proposed them. I think removing the distance requirements between the same retailers, that's the smart thing to do. The few folks that were here that were residents, I know at the last meeting they were, I remember at least one was pretty adamant, but keeping it 1,000 from the residential. Again, yeah, I'm not opposed to that. That seems to be the prevalent request for most of the residents I've spoken to. So, but yeah, I do like your recommendation though for the removal of the other ones.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to also echo what Mark had just said. There are, I do believe that the 1,000-foot buffer is the right answer for our little fellow community people, as well as our churchgoers and our substance abuse facilities. The reason I say that is, yes, there is carbon filtering. There are systems out there that do mitigate the smell, but at some point we're going to have to police that. And one of the ways that we can police that is to keep that 1,000-foot buffer away from the residential areas. There are facilities that you go by, and you're more than 1,000 feet, and you can smell it. So I'm absolutely in agreement. That's the reason I didn't bring that up in my prior narrative. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Mr. Jaworski?
Yeah, I don't know if this is the time to address it. I know we have some very strong signage regulations in the township as far as, how much can be square footage, advertising the business. But I know in other communities, there's verbiage about using specific wording. They cannot use marijuana. They cannot use pot. Is that something that we should address in this particular document, or is that statewide?
We haven't included anything in the standards at this time, thinking that your sign ordinance is pretty good in terms of regulating signage. And then where do we draw the line? right? If we said, well, these words are prohibited, but we can't keep up with terminology, so next year, there could be a whole new set of words that we didn't realize we should have outlawed, if you will.
Well, I thought there was townships that already had that in place.
There are some. The state statute's sort of vague in saying that communities can regulate signage effectively by content, which we try to avoid right now. So I think, and if you would like to chime in on that, but we weren't really thinking that was an additional effort that you needed to do at this time.
Yeah, I mean, Rick brought this up maybe at the last meeting or maybe after the last meeting. There are dozens and dozens, and more than that, of federal district court and federal court of appeals decisions, and when I say recent, within the last 10 years, United States Supreme Court decision, which essentially said municipalities cannot regulate the content of a message of a sign. Now, there are exceptions to that rule, like there's exceptions to every rule. If it's pornographic or obscene, there's First Amendment exceptions to that. But as a general rule, you have a ballot proposition that was approved by the voters back, a handful of years ago, that was, I don't know, 20,000 words. And marijuana is postered all over the ballot. Right. You've got a statute now where marijuana's every definition starts with the word marijuana. We sat in a webinar last week with the Cannabis Regulatory Agency administrators from municipalities telling about law enforcement of cannabis. I mean, the word is everywhere. And, to say to somebody, you've met our dimensional requirements, but you cannot have a sign which says cannabis, if you got challenged on it, the first question a judge asks is, since you're regulating content of speech, what is the compelling governmental interest in the regulation? And if you think about it, it doesn't come to mind right away. What would be the compelling governmental interest in prohibiting a marijuana establishment from using the word cannabis? Anybody? There isn't any. I mean, you got to be fair. There isn't any. And I think, so far, I think all of the things that you've discussed are reasonable. I think the comments from the members of the audience are reasonable as well. Some I don't agree with. I think maybe they're overstating their position. But I think the regulations that you're putting in this draft zoning ordinance are reasonable. Jonathan and Stephanie and Jill and I have sat down. We've gone over this ordinance more than once or twice or three times. We have looked at other ordinances in the state. These regulate consistent with what I would call the mainstream zoning ordinance regulations. There are the outliers. There are communities, I'm sure, that you can point to that will say, well, that community has a content regulation in their ordinance. I think it's going to be unconstitutional. And it doesn't make sense to go through all this work to put together a zoning ordinance that is totally sustainable, but get greedy and start imposing regulations that put us on that fringe of somebody challenging it. And then when it gets challenged, the ordinance gets struck down after all this work. So, and furthermore, if you're putting them in the manufacturing zone, be it M1 or M2, who's in the zone that's going to be offended by it? This is a manufacturing facility. I mean,
So-
your kids aren't going to Sunday school, looking at these signs that's marijuana leaf. I mean,
So you've just kind of addressed what I was getting
so
at.
what I would say is leave it alone. Stick with the typical sign regulations that you have: the light, the size, the width, the material, the basic non-content-based criteria, and you're home free, and nobody's going to be able to make a successful challenge.
So I'm just going to finalize my comments on that. So M1, M2 makes all the sense in the world, but I can see that there's going to be challenges for other districts, especially down Gratiot Avenue, where it's majority industrial, frontage, et cetera, and where I was going with the question was, right now, you're opening it up unlimited. I've heard that multiple times. And once you get that many folks coming in and putting up stores, they're going to want to get as loud as they can with their signage, their lighting, et cetera, et cetera. So we still have to consider the, what is it, the 43% of the folks that voted no on this particular ballot issue and make it harmonious with the surrounding neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where I was going with it.
Anybody else? Seeing nothing? Oh. Okay, Mark.
I don't know if this is the right forum for this, but I was sitting in on that same Zoom call, which actually I found pretty informative. And one of the things they had mentioned was that during license renewal, I know there was at least one town, or there are at least two townships, I believe, that had the requirement in there that for the renewal that there had to be like the community reinvestment grading, where they had that gold, silver, bronze rating for people that donated back into the community. Is that something that can be done as part of this, or is that something that's done elsewhere?
Yeah, I heard the same presentation that you did. I represent a municipal client right now where there was a ballot proposal where the ballot language that was more detailed than the language that we have here. They even had the scoring criteria in the ballot proposal, and one of the scoring items was essentially giving back to the community, giving to food banks and things like that. Now, the municipality didn't adopt that language. We inherited it by virtue of a ballot proposal that the voters passed. So there wasn't anything we could do about it. But I would be suspect of, in a renewal. And by the way, there's going to be a separate licensing ordinance that's a regulatory ordinance that the board will adopt that we already have completed. But it's not ready for prime time until this zoning ordinance is ready, because we want to make sure they mirror image one another and there's no inconsistencies. But I would stay away from any renewal benefits of, local businesses, hiring local people. There's a recent Michigan Court of Appeals case said that the Michigan Constitution is violated if you start giving local preference to local people. There's no legitimate governmental interest in saying a company that comes into Chesterfield that wants to sell or grow cannabis does any better job because they hire a Chesterfield resident than a Shelby resident. I mean, that argument wasn't a strong one to start with, and the Court of Appeals blew it off. So I would stay away from those types of things. I would stick to the basic garden variety zoning issues, and you will have an ordinance that is going to be rock solid.
No, thanks. That's
Don't get too
I was just curious.
I would stay away.
It piqued my interest.
I heard it, but I would stay away from it.
Okay.
The more extravagant you get, and the more off-road you get, the greater likelihood is that somebody that doesn't get their facility approved is going to take you on. And I'd rather have the ordinance be rock solid than try to get too cute with it.
No, that's fair. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Mr. Chairman, could I ask one thing?
Okay, one more.
Yeah, we're not limiting the square footage or anything like that, are we? Because that seems to be an area where we could get into a little bit of trouble, too.
We don't have that in there currently, and I haven't heard much support for that.
No, because you could have facilities which have multiple licensing things, processing, growing, these vertically integrated facilities, and I think that's something we should probably stay away from.
Okay. I'll make a motion to adjourn. We have a motion by Mr. Miller, supported by Mr. Renault. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Motion passes.